The numbers game, how left-wing terrorism is on the rise, concedes a half-truth while hiding the full scale of left-wing political violence. The Atlantic finally admitted what reality has been screaming for years. Left-wing attacks now outnumber right-wing attacks. That is the headline claim. But the body of the argument, driven by a Center for Strategic and International Studies dataset, is a study in narrative control by definition. The article explicitly relies on a curated set of terrorism incidents and quietly excludes the very categories where left-wing violence has been most prolific since 2016. Riot violence, protest-linked assaults and arsons, mass vandalism campaigns, and most school and church shootings unless an obvious declared political motive is present. In other words, the admission is a half-truth. Yes, left-wing terrorism has overtaken the right in their ledger this year, but only after you throw out a mountain of left-wing ideological violence by labeling it as something else. Start with what the article concedes. The authors say they compiled 750 attacks and plots in the United States from January 1994 through July 2025, and that 2025 is the first year in more than 3 decades when left-wing attacks outnumber far-right ones. That alone runs against years of media framing. But the same team's own methodology document makes the real story obvious. The counting rules are engineered to omit much of what a normal person recognizes as political terror. The codebook states that violence at demonstrations was generally excluded, and that many attacks on businesses, government facilities, and even entire categories of economic sabotage were excluded too, because perpetrators sought to avoid killing or maiming people, or were deemed to be sending a message only to a narrow audience. It also carves out most school shootings on the claim that they usually lack a clear political objective. Put simply, the dataset is designed to undercount left-wing violence where it has been most active since 2020. Those exclusions are not minor footnotes. They remove the signature left-wing tactics of the past decade from the terrorism ledger. Black bloc operations that torch police cars, smash government windows and attack courthouses, autonomous zone occupations with armed intimidation, synchronized riot waves that cause billions in damage across dozens of cities, coordinated harassment and assaults at political events, the ritualized vandalism of ideological targets from churches to pregnancy centers to corporate offices. According to the codebook, escalation at demonstrations was generally excluded, with only rare inclusions like the Charlottesville car attack specifically called out as an exception. That is the definitional trapdoor. When left-wing violence happens inside a protest or riot context, it exits the terrorism dataset. Now, layer in cost and spread. Insurance and risk analysts documented that the 2020 unrest was the most expensive period of civil disorder in modern United States history, with insured losses alone topping $1 to $2 billion. And that was only the portion actually insured, not the full economic damage or the human toll. By any common-sense measure, that is political violence used to coerce policy and intimidate communities nationwide. Yet almost all of it is discarded by terrorism coders because it occurred under the umbrella of demonstrations, or because attackers tried to time arsons when buildings were unoccupied, or because the intimidation effect was deemed insufficiently broad. The codebook lists its source stack, starts Global Terrorism Database, ACLI-D, ADL Maps, SPLC Maps, Janes, New America, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the Department of Justice, with cross-referencing to national papers like the New York Times and the Washington Post. That is an overtly left-leaning ecosystem for classification, framing, and event selection. It also builds a methodological funnel that tends to catch and label plots discussed in right-wing online spaces, while treating massive waves of left-wing street violence as civil unrest outside the scope of terrorism. The result is predictable. An undercount of left-wing incidents at scale and an over-documentation of discrete far-right plots. Consider what the exclusions do in practice. First, escalation at demonstrations. The design choice to generally exclude violence tied to protests removes a gigantic category of left-wing action. If a black bloc cell firebombs a police precinct during a march, it is not in the book. If a masked crew smashes out the windows of a federal courthouse or corporate headquarters and tags it with revolutionary slogans, it is not in the book. If a pro-abortion anarchist cell attacks a church, crisis pregnancy center, or pro-life office during or adjacent to a demonstration, it often falls out of scope unless the authors can prove an explicit plot and a declared political goal beyond the obvious. The codebook justifies this by claiming there was lack of lethal force and lack of evidence of perpetrators' desire to have a widespread psychological impact. That is absurd on its face. The point of these spectacle arsons and mob attacks is precisely psychological: to terrorize a city into submission and to project power against political enemies. Second, economic sabotage exclusions erase classic left-wing targeting. The codebook explicitly removes many environmentalist and anti-capitalist arsons and sabotages from the 1990s and 2000s because perpetrators opposed harming people and focused on property at unoccupied sites, even as they targeted symbols of industry and the state. It even notes that attacks on Tesla facilities in 2025 were excluded as economic vandalism. That is the heart of modern left-wing direct action: economic intimidation to force political concessions. Deleting it from the terrorism column turns a forest fire into a campfire. Third, the school shooting carve-out is a gift to ideologically motivated shooters when targets are Christian or conservative institutions. The rule says most school shootings lack clear political objectives, so they are generally excluded. But when a transgender-identifying shooter chooses a Christian elementary school and leaves written materials that point to grievance ideology, that is political targeting by any rational standard. The official after-action documents and court filings around the Nashville Covenant School attack demonstrate deliberate selection of a Christian school and contain references the public has only partially seen due to ongoing withholding of documents, yet such incidents are structurally routed away from the terrorism dataset unless the compilers decide the political motive is clear enough. This is how definitional discretion launders ideology out of the numbers. Meanwhile, the Atlantic piece lifts the tidy takeaway from this same dataset. Left-wing incidents are up, and in 2025, they outnumber the far right for the first time since the early 1990s. That framing functions as controlled disclosure. It preserves the fiction that only now have left-wing attacks surpassed the right, and only in a narrow slice of carefully coded terrorism events, while sidestepping the obvious. If you simply count the left-wing violence that any normal person experiences as terror, the left blew past the right years ago. There is another quiet move in the codebook that matters for the public conversation. A disclaimer that extreme right and extreme left do not refer to mainstream political parties, conservatives, or liberals. In principle, that is correct, and it is important to say out loud, the far-right label is not synonymous with a Trump or MAGA supporter, a Republican, or a church-going conservative. In practice, however, the same classification sources, media partners, and activist organizations smear those categories together in coverage and advocacy. The researchers themselves stress the distinction, but their source ecosystem relentlessly blurs it in public discourse. Add it all up and the pattern is obvious. 1. Selection bias. The dataset relies on institutions whose business model and ideology prime them to highlight right-wing plots and to treat left-wing mobilized violence as protest or unrest. 2. Category design. Exclusions for protest-linked violence, economic sabotage, and most school shootings surgically remove signature left-wing tactics. That forces the ledger to undercount the left, no matter how intense the actual violence becomes. 3. Narrative management. Media can now cite a prestigious study to concede, in a limited way, that left-wing terrorism is on the rise, and even outnumbers the right in 2025, while continuing to minimize the past decade's riot terror and institutional targeting that every citizen witnessed. The Atlantic article is exactly that move. A narrow admission wrapped in an architecture of exclusions. 4. Real-world impact. Insured losses from the 2020 unrest alone reached catastrophic levels, exceeding the 1992 Los Angeles riots and dwarfing many classic terrorism years. If a coordinated wave that expensive, widespread, and explicitly political does not count as terrorism in your system is built to miss the point. The bottom line is straightforward. The Atlantic's headline is accurate within the confines of the chosen definitions. But the definitions are doing all the heavy lifting. When you restore the excluded categories that ordinary people recognize as political terror, riot violence, black bloc arson and vandalism against state and corporate targets, organized attacks nested inside demonstrations, and ideologically targeted shootings of Christian and conservative institutions, the picture flips from a modest uptick to an overwhelming reality. Left-wing political violence has been shielded in the numbers by design and shielded in the narrative by a media and tech ecosystem that treats it as activism rather than terror. The study's own rulebook gives the game away.